Hello. It's time again for the Daily Bolt with your host, Dr. Jeff Tilley. Today's topic, Issues in Science Education, Part 9. You get what you pay for. Sort of. Sit back and relax and enjoy this podcast. So, the last few podcasts I've been kind of building up to this one in terms of certain pieces that I've dropped in terms of topics. And now we're coming to one of the places where the rubber meets the road, which is how much money do schools really have to work with for science education? And there's a couple of different ways that these threads from the previous podcasts come about and work their way into the answer to this question. One is politics and administrations. And the politics can actually be local. They can be within the school. They can be within the community. They can be within the state. All of these elements can interact to determine just what resources schools have to work with to devote to science education. The short answer is generally not enough for most schools. It doesn't matter whether necessarily you're in a poor district or a rich district. Local school choices made by administrators, whether they be superintendents, principals, vice principals, even department heads, can determine how much money there actually is for science teaching. I know the school that I taught at over this past year didn't necessarily, at least from what I could see, make science teaching very much of a priority. And in fact, the school board and the superintendent in some ways didn't seem to make even teachers a priority. And this worked fine in terms of the public mindset, because the public mindset there in that district was a district where a lot of people didn't want to pay anything in taxes. They think that somehow something is magically going to come down from the sky and pay for the schools. And even the school funding formula doesn't allot for a whole lot of options for local governments in terms of paying for the schools. And typically, it requires special elections to raise funds, new funds, unless there's some new huge business entity coming into town that perhaps somehow doesn't get a tax break, which these days seems to happen a lot with big business. Not saying that's good or bad, it just is. And when you have a funding formula that disproportionately depends on business activity and property ownership for funding the schools, that is not a model to allow for aggressive growth in any type of educational program, or even just aggressive growth in buying the supplies and the tools and having the teachers you need to be able to really do the job the way it needs to be done. Materials get more expensive. Utilities get more expensive every year. Teachers, even though many of them are not very well paid, and that's another piece of all this, often need to have a little more money year after year just to account for things like normal cost of living increases, inflation, all sorts of other aspects. And if you have a school district or a community college district or a community or a state that doesn't want to put the money into the schools, the quality of the education can only naturally be expected to suffer. And in fact, there are quite a few schools, more K through 12 than at the collegiate level, which there's usually enough of a candidate pool in many fields, maybe not all, but many, so that they don't have to put someone in a position who's unqualified to teach that particular subject. When it comes to K through 12, that can be a different story. And part of the issue there is the fact that in many parts of the country, public school teachers are not particularly well paid. So here's a question that you need to ask yourself. in terms of public school teacher pay. You could even take this up into the community college level and maybe to some smaller colleges. Major research universities often pay relatively well in terms of teaching staff, although perhaps not always. I'm not going to say that there aren't exceptions. But the bigger problems are the farther down in the food chain, as you get to younger and younger grade levels, where in some respects teaching becomes all that much more critical. So here's the question. How much do you really value your teachers? The ones that teach your kids, the one that teach the neighbor's kids, even if you don't have kids anymore, you still have the families in the neighborhood, in the city, and it all goes down into helping provide a better quality of life for everyone in the community. Or at least that's the argument that's made. But how much do you really value teachers? And while you're thinking about that, then think about some other things. How much do you value a car? How much do you value good food? How much do you value a house to live in? These are all things that you pay money for because you value them. And there's an adage that basically states that if something is free, then it probably doesn't have a whole lot of value. This gives something to really think about in terms of modern arguments for free education, whether it be through K through 12, whether it be through college, community college, even graduate school in some circles. Free, everything should be free. Well, what does that really mean? Does that mean that you really don't value it? Not enough to work for it? That it should just be given? It's an interesting question to pose as to whether the fact that people who have not had to work to support themselves to get an education value it the same extent that others that have had to work. I think there is certainly some statistics out there that exist that would suggest that those who have had to work for their education value it more, get more out of it, and ultimately it has a bigger impact on the degree of success they have in their lives. Anyone can make anything for free and have it be a piece of crap. Not everyone can value something enough to pay what it's really worth. And I would submit that in many parts of the country, K through 12 teachers are not paid anywhere close to what they are truly worth. And there seems to be this acceptance of this fact. And yet, the people who have the kids that go to the schools, that have businesses in the community, would never think of not charging a fair price for their product or service. That would be totally incomprehensible to them. So why does this concept apply to business, that you get what you pay for, more or less? The more you pay, the better quality you expect. Why does this not apply to education? And the argument can be made, well, it's public education, then we pay taxes and that helps support the schools. Well, then it's not really free. So the question remains, though, is what's being paid in taxes, particularly if it's more a property tax, a business owner that pays really for the education. Is it really paying the value that the community expects to get from the education? I would submit to you that in many cases it does not. And as a result, you have people get hired for teaching positions who are not the best fits, who are not the most qualified, who don't even know the foggiest thing about the subject, but it's all that the school districts can get. And so the quality of the education, especially in the sciences where significant specific knowledge is required to teach the course, suffers. And I can speak this from personal experience to a degree. I came in partway through the school year, this past year, in teaching middle school. I took over the classes from a long-term substitute who was certified in English, but she was all that the district had, and they forced her into teaching my science classes, the ones I would pick up. She had no science teaching background. She had very little science knowledge. And even though she relied as much as she could on the other science teachers, they only had so much time because they had a full slate of classes of their own. And ultimately, the kids didn't learn very much at all. And yet, this is happening all the time. You get substitutes who are not well-versed in the subject matters that they're teaching, having to teach for long-term periods. Not just weeks, we're talking months, we're talking a full school year, we're talking even more than one school year. And it's because the districts can't find qualified staff. But somebody has to teach the course. And districts can't find qualified staff because the qualified staff want to actually make a living and not be in poverty. Now, that's one side of the coin of you get what you pay for. But here comes the sort of. There are very rich districts, wealthy districts that have boatloads of money coming into them. They could get the best teachers, the best equipment, supplies, facilities that the money can buy. And they continually go back to their community, ask for more money in terms of tax mill levies, and they pretty much get it because they make an argument, well, it's for the kids. And you have people that will just keep throwing money at schools because it's for the kids. And in theory, that sounds great. In practice, it doesn't always work out that way. Many school boards, district superintendents, principals, and vice principals have their own agendas as to what they think is important in schools. And they will direct dollars to those agendas far before they correct fundamental deficiencies that might exist in their schools. Here's an example for you. The school district that I taught in this past year, there were budget issues where there were mistakes in the accounting. And as a result, there were expected to be major budget cuts, teachers being laid off, as much as 30 positions being eliminated in a district where 30 positions represents a significant fraction. It's not trivial. And during a school board meeting, statements were made, and this is all in the public record and could be found out unless it's been redacted somehow. And it wouldn't surprise me if that's actually happened in this district. But the question came up, what happens if we can get the funds restored? And the superintendent's answer was that she wasn't necessarily interested in bringing back any of the staff that would be let go. She had her own programs, her own priorities she wanted to direct the money to. That included increasing computerization of education, more of these blended learning classes where you have less direct teaching time and you have more the students learning everything on their own by computer because it's cheaper. Another thing was to ensure that every child had a free lunch. Doesn't matter whether the child came from a family that had $1 million or a child came from a family that had $100. Everybody gets a free lunch. Free, free, free. Is that a good use of educational dollars? I suppose it depends on who you ask. But from my perspective, anytime that you take from the teaching function and you give it to something else, you're diluting the impact of any increase in resources that you might get. Teachers are an important resource. They are undervalued completely. No other profession undervalues the amount of preparation in terms of education and experience and the hard work that teachers do. So the last question I'm going to leave you with this podcast. Do you think you really value your teachers, what they're worth? Think about that, particularly the next time a budget issue comes up with the school in your district or a bond issue comes up to raise money. Or you just meet a teacher. Are we really paying them what they're worth? On that note, this is Dr. Jeff Tilley. This is the Daily Bold Podcast. Depending on when you're listening, good night, good morning, good afternoon, and God bless.